本次大会的第一个 panel discussion 主题：亚洲碳交易市场与台湾。本场的主持人是来自国立台北大学自然资源与环境管理研究所的李坚明教授，他是台湾首屈一指的碳交易权威顾问。
Professor Lee is a well-respected expert in carbon credit study from the Institute of National Resources Management. Please join me in welcoming our host panel, Professor Lee.
掌声欢迎李坚明教授。
主席，还有各位今天与会的贵宾，大家早。那我非常荣幸那么在今天的这个全国的净零减碳大会第一届由民间举办的这样的一个会议，那么在第二场有关于亚洲的碳交易市场的发展，那么来担任主持人。那我想我还是一句话，那么我们讲的净零，其实就是刚刚我们罗执行长提到的，其实就是一个伙伴合作。那伙伴合作要怎么合作？那么透过巴黎协定的第6条，就是彼此之间透过资金、透过技术、透过碳权的交易，这就是一个最佳的一个合作的方式。所以我常这样讲，那么净零呢，这个碳权交易，它就是一个净零拉近我们净零的一个距离的最佳方案。那所以我想今天呢，我们在这个场次，那么在台湾首次的邀请到去年在新加坡成立的 CIX， 而且它是以未来国际上最主流的 Nature-based Solution 为主要的交易标的。这是一个相当有前瞻性，而且相当于对于整个国际净零会产生一个非常非常大的 driving force 的一个交易所。所以我们今天非常荣幸的会邀请到这个交易所的主要的主持人，那来为我们来说明这个交易所的成立，还有它的发展，以及未来我们台湾的企业那怎么样的有机会能够跟这个交易所也能够有一些合作。那我想这个是一个目前产业界在净零的发展路径上一个非常重要的解方，最主要就是它是一个成本有效。那另外我们也非常非常荣幸，那么邀请到目前在国际的自愿性市场最重要的一个这个标准就是 VCS， 那背后呢是由一个组织叫 VERRA， 那 VERRA 呢基本上是由2大国际的大组织来支持，一个组织呢就是世界经济论坛，这非常非常著名，非常有公信力。第二个是国际碳排放交易推广协会，它几乎就是在推动全世界碳交易的一个联合国底下的一个非常重要的组织，由他们在05年成立，那到今天呢，已经做了非常好的一个发展。所以我们今天也很荣幸，请到 VERRA 的 CEO 来跟我们做他们的最新的发展。那我想这个发展我们会听到，他们怎么样去跟新加坡的政府的碳税的这个做一些连结，因为它可以做碳税的抵换。我们也会听到说，他们可能已经在推动跟泰国的这个碳交易制度怎么样去做协助。那所以在亚洲，那目前呢已经有好几个地方在推动碳交易，最大的就是中国大陆，其次呢就是韩国。那日本的话呢，大概是城市层级，东京都还有另外一个城市埼玉县。那么在亚洲，台湾其实是1999年开始规划，可是我们现在还没有。那眼见着我们东南亚国家，印尼、越南、泰国也即将要启动。 那所以在整个净零的这个路径上，其实叫做 Race to Zero， 大家其实是在赛跑。所以我想一个好的制度，如果我们跑得不够快，那将来会失去很多的机会。所以我想接下来，那我们的时间呢，其实我们今天还有欧莱德董事长啊，我们的这个葛董事长哈，也跟我们在做这样的一个讨论哈。那我想因为时间因素，我们开始就请线上的这个贵宾来做我们的演讲。好，谢谢。
请欧莱德国际股份有限公司的葛望秉董事长上台跟我们一起参与。
So just a little bit of a recap. Today we have two very honorable guests, Ms. Soh, representing CIX, and we also have Mr. Antonioli, the CEO of VERRA. And these two honorable guests really mean a lot to us in Taiwan because Climate Impact X help the customers to take practical actions in decarbonization journey. It is a global exchange for quality voluntary carbon credits that drives environmental impact at a scale. And through resilient platforms, innovative partners, and a fostering ecosystem, companies, buyers, and sellers can take practical climate mitigation action on trusted carbon credits. That is what CIX is representing. And as for VERRA, VERRA is a global leader in helping tackling the world's the most intractable environmental and social challenges by developing and managing standards that help the private sector, countries, and civil society achieve ambitious, sustainable development and climate action goals. And recently, VERRA has been collaborating with Singapore as well as Thailand and many other Asian countries. We are so excited to hear what VERRA has to offer in the presentation with us today. So please let us warmly welcome our two honorable guests that are already with us online. 我们欢迎拍手，掌声拍手。And first, we're going to have Ms. Soh to start her presentation regarding CIX. Thank you.
谢谢主持人。各位好，我是新加坡CIX平台负责人苏珍玲，很荣幸代表 CIX 参加台湾第一届净零减碳大会。我的中文说的不太好，接下来我以英文来代表，请多多包涵。Thank you all today for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for the very gracious introductions. I'm Genevieve, the head of platforms and ecosystems here at Climate Impact X. I'm heartened to hear all of the discussion earlier on about the energy crisis and how Taiwan is looking at net zero really as an opportunity and not a burden or a challenge going forward. And I think CIX, VERRA, and the likes of our many partners share that vision with you, that net zero shouldn't be purely a challenge, but really an opportunity for the future. I want to share a little bit about who we are as CIX, as well as how we could be helpful to the folks in the room here today as they think about how they want to take action on their net zero journeys. So I'll start a little bit at the beginning, which is, who are we exactly and what do we do? We are a carbon credit marketplace and exchange based out here in Singapore. Our shareholders are DBS, Standard Chartered Bank, Temasek, and the Singapore Exchange. So we're really formed by large stakeholders who see carbon as a critical and strategic asset that large corporates like yourselves need to be engaged in to be able to facilitate a net zero transition. And when we got started, we fully understood on this net zero journey, many people will be struggling with the following, which is, how do I actually get to net zero? And clearly there's a carbon mitigation hierarchy for many companies, which is to try and baseline, set targets, reduce and report transparently. But that net in net zero suggests that we will all come up against a wall, whether or not it is technology limitations or cost effectiveness, where carbon credits can play a part in helping us to get to that point of zero. And so when we looked at carbon credits, we saw this as a credible, important green financing tool. And we started to look into this space to try and understand how can we help to grow and scale and really foster a market, as well as this tool to become more sophisticated for different companies to use. When we looked into it at the very beginning, we saw for companies that wanted to take part, there was a challenge for access. And it was really driven by a few things. One was just a lack of understanding and the need for education around what exactly are carbon credits and what can they be used for. The second is a lack of transparency around pricing. And this, I think, was very reflective. When we got started nearly 2 years ago, whenever someone asked us, what's the real price for carbon? How do I pay for a project and know that it's the right price to pay? It was very simply the fact that because it was mostly a bilateral negotiation, you could be quoted anything really, and it would be onto the company that was buying to try and figure out what is it worth. And finally, there was a lot of complexity. I think some of this complexity is actually good. It's reflective of a lot of the innovation that's happening in the space. But for a company, if you're a chief sustainability officer looking at this for the first time, it is overwhelming, right? There are so many registries, so many different types of credit, different pricing. What should you buy? What could you claim based on what you've bought and retired? All of that, gave people a sense that there's lack of confidence to go take action. And I think today what I wanted to share was I feel like many of the companies in Taiwan have started already on their journey, many of them super progressive, and we've been in the marketplace and publicly working with some of these, including companies like Team. And we do this because our core promise is trust, the ability to help companies who want to get participating in carbon credits, the ability to know they can trust in the product. And when they buy and execute with a platform that they can trust, they know they're not going to run into issues with double counting or double claiming because we work with the right registries, such as VERRA, for example. And so we wanted to share a little bit about, the fact that, yes, we are a trading platform. We are dedicated to serving both corporates as well as large financial institutions and traders because we have a community of different actors. So on one hand, we've got the marketplace, which is almost like a B2B Amazon for carbon credits. It's easy to discover, to compare, to find the right prices, and learn the details about the projects that you need to know. And on the other hand, we do have an exchange, which is more standardized and is more geared towards companies who would want to be able to trade in standardized contracts. And that allows for us to bring the liquidity needed to the markets to discover that pricing that people can trust. And what I'll say is that we're more than just trading platforms. I think when anyone hears carbon credit exchange, they think, it's just to buy and sell. But I think we've gone beyond that to invest in being a community. And you see this on the screen here. We take this very seriously because we work very deeply with our partners. We see ourselves as more than just purely an exchange. We work with governments, with banks, with technology providers, with universities to really try to bring that education to corporates so that they can take action. Most recently, we're running the second round of an executive course for professionals who want to understand sustainability. And we've partnered with the National University of Singapore to offer that. We've also worked with governments to be able to help them understand how they can price some of their credits. And of course, with partners like VERRA, we engage in their consultative processes and are very supportive of some of their new standards as well. So I'll stop here and basically say that if you're a buyer, a seller, an investor in carbon credits, we hope that you see us as a partner and join us in our community to be able to start to understand for yourself and take action in the carbon credit space. So I'll pause there and maybe hand over back to the host to see if there are questions. If not, I think it's over to David.
Thank you so much, Ms. Soh, for your wonderful presentation, helping us to understand that CIX is a community that is backed up by government and institutions, and that CIX aims to position Singapore as a hub for carbon-related services and nature-based solutions. Next, we also have Mr. Antonioli representing VERRA to also give us an inspiring presentation. Join me and let us give Mr. Antonioli a warm applause. 我们掌声鼓励。
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. I wanted to just share today with you a few thoughts about the role voluntary markets can play in global climate action. The voluntary markets are really they've been around for a while, but I think only recently have we realized the power that they can have to really drive change. And that's what I'm going to kind of talk about today. So I'll give you a brief introduction and context for what the voluntary markets are doing and who we are as VERRA, and give you some quick information about where we see the market is now and where we think it might be going in the future. So just a quick introduction to VERRA. We are a nonprofit organization established in 2007. We manage the world's leading greenhouse gas crediting program. That's the Verified Carbon Standard, the VCS program. And we also have a number of standards that look at measuring and assessing the social impacts of projects. And those are the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard and the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standards. And to date, there's almost 2,000 projects that have been registered under the VCS system, and they've issued collectively almost 1 billion carbon credits. I was looking at that number today and was updating the slide and got to 989 million. So it's quite an impact for an organization that really is helping to channel a lot of finance to climate action. And it's certainly very exciting to hear all of the work that's happening in Taiwan in respect of achieving climate action and the drive towards net zero. So just to put a little bit of the markets in context, I'd like to use this slide because if you think about what we need to achieve 1.5 degrees if we're going to be reaching that 1.5 degrees by 2030, we would need 27 gigatons of emission reductions. And the voluntary market in 2021 issued 0.2 gigatons of emission reductions. That's the white little bit in that slide. And it's projected that maybe the voluntary markets might end up, increasing to the tune of creating, 3 gigatons, if possible, of emission reductions. And that's great. And that's an important contribution. But I think what's really important to emphasize is that, in an ideal world, carbon credits are complementing additional reductions that companies are making to their own footprint. And so this really kind of follows the idea that carbon credits are a complementary tool, they're a transition tool, and they really need to follow the measuring of the footprint, the reductions internally, and then come the investments in projects that are outside of the boundary of a company that serve to offset and compensate for the emissions that you cannot reduce today, given that we rely on an economy that's largely still dependent on fossil fuels. So this is the graph that you might have seen before. This really describes the trajectory that companies ideally are following, right? So we're at today, kind of on the left-hand side of the graph, and companies are taking net zero targets. Ideally, it's 2050, but ideally it might be even earlier. And so they're on a pathway to reducing their emissions over time until they get to, roughly 90 to 95% reductions from where we are today. So that means that by 2050, ideally, we will be emitting roughly 5 to 10% of the emissions that we emit today. And that's because companies will be reducing their emissions over time to be able to achieve that net zero target. And then at that point, you will see this part of the slide that focuses on the removals. So at that point, when we reach net zero means that even though we're still emitting emissions to the atmosphere, we're compensating them with removal. So we're drawing out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at an equivalent rate of what we're putting in the atmosphere. But in between now and 2050, what happens with all the emissions that we're still going to be emitting to the atmosphere? And this right here is where the great opportunity is for the voluntary market today, because it provides a ready-made infrastructure to finance emission reductions and removals. It can scale rapidly, and investment in the voluntary market today will make the future challenge easier because we won't see all those greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So that's really the key sweet spot and where we think the voluntary market can have such a tremendous impact on the environment and in our efforts to address climate change. I did want to mention two very important initiatives that are taking place. Genevieve described a little bit about the concerns that companies have when they enter the market. And there's a wide array of different project types. There's different standard setting bodies like VERRA. And so companies don't really have confidence that they know what's a real carbon credit. And on the other side, they don't really know what kind of claim they can make. So these two initiatives are seeking to solve that. The first one is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and it's seeking to establish a threshold performance for high quality credits so that when companies like many of you represent enter the market, ideally you can look at the ICVCM outcome and say, okay, they've approved these projects and I'm comfortable investing in these projects approved or developed under certain crediting programs like the VCS. And then on the other side of the ledger, on the demand side, you've got the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. And that's meant to establish guidance on the kinds of claims that corporates can make when purchasing and retiring carbon credits. And this goes to the idea that companies ideally are reducing their emissions first and compensating for the emissions after. So again, if a company is able to reduce its emissions and compensate, then it can make a credible claim that it's on a true carbon neutral net zero pathway. And of course, we sit right in the middle, right? So we have our standards, and they're kind of the glue that hold this market together. So just a few ideas or information about the voluntary carbon markets, which I thought would be useful to share with you as we think about where we're going. So this graph describes what we consider the three different stages of the market, starting back in 2005, when it was very early, very small, and it was really just pioneering and thinking of new things. And then, starting at around 2008, the market started to consolidate. There was the evolution of best practices. The private sector became increasingly engaged, and there were new project types that started to be developed, especially in the natural climate solutions. So forest conservation, especially forest reforestation, and we're now seeing even more different kinds of projects in that sector, in that agriculture and forestry sector. And then, 2017, what we started to see is that there was a market growth. Corporates started really becoming very engaged in the process. Very important things happened. So you started to see the acceptance of voluntary market infrastructure in government regulated programs. So for example, in Colombia, the government has a carbon tax. And the government of Colombia says, actually, you can use a carbon credit issued under the Clean Development Mechanism of the United Nations, under the gold standard, and under the VCS program by VERRA. And you can surrender a carbon credit instead of paying the carbon tax. So there was a real recognition that the infrastructure built in the voluntary market could really help to serve not only the voluntary markets, but regulated markets as well. And this was also confirmed by the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation that was developed and implemented under ICAO. So over time, you've seen this growth, and you can see this in the numbers from our registry. And these are the number of issuances in the program. And so the green line shows the total numbers, but I did want to point out one really important change, and it's in 2016, where you see that what we mean by this graph is we have AFLU issuances, and those are issuances from agriculture, forestry, and other land use credits. And non-AFLU issuances are basically projects in the industrial and energy sectors. And until 2016, the main source of credits in the market had been industrial and energy sector projects. But in 2016, at least in the VCS program, that switched. And we started to see more issuances of AFLU projects, so forest conservation in particular. In 2019, that flipped a little bit, but it seemed to have self-corrected. But going forward, this could change again because we're starting to see a lot of interest in new technologies, especially a lot of interest in removals. These are the kinds of projects that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and deposit it in natural systems or in technological solutions. So you've got, again, we have natural climate solutions, which include afforestation, reforestation, revegetation. You've got agricultural land management, so that's called soil carbon generally. Biochar is another example. And you've got technological solutions like direct air capture, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and enhanced weathering. So there's a number of different new approaches that are being developed, although these take time, especially for natural climate solutions, or very expensive. So we'll see over time how this plays out, but there is an increasing interest in removals, particularly because we will need to have these approaches in 2050 when we're reaching that net zero stage. And this final slide is really just to illustrate what I think is an interesting description of where we think the opportunities are. There's a number of emerging opportunities. You'd see them here on the right. It's jurisdictional conservation of forests, blue carbon, hard to abate sectors, cement, shipping, aviation. And there's, of course, a whole suite of different technologies related to the energy transition. But the interesting thing about this graph is that it illustrates where there are emissions trading systems. It illustrates what sectors are covered. And what you can see here is that as countries start to move to regulate their sectors, they start by regulating the most likely or the easiest sectors to identify. So that tends to be the power sector, industry, buildings, and that's why the center of that circle is filled out for most of the emissions trading systems. But as you get further out, there's fewer and fewer of these sectors covered. And even, as you'll see, only New Zealand regulates the forestry sector. So this is an interesting indicator of where we think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for projects in the future, especially in the agriculture and the forestry sector. But over time, again, we'll start to see a lot more emphasis potentially in energy transition projects and certainly in removals projects. So that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to take questions now or later. But again, it's been a real honor to be with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Antonioli, to learn how VERRA is creating such a strong impact worldwide and covering so many industries, as well as going internationally. Now we have our next speaker representing Allright. And let us also welcome our next honorable speaker. We will have all our speakers finish their presentation, and that's when we will have our overall question and answer session. So if our guests online could continue to stay with us, bear with us, and we are entering into our last presentation for the first panel. Let us welcome Mr. Koh.
好，谢谢主持人哦，那谢谢大会的邀请，跟谢谢李建明老师哈，就是我想老师现在来请我报告一下这几年的他做碳中和的经验了啊，那希望一个 SME 做碳中和的经验，可以给大家在一个周六那么早起来哈，然后大家就罗执行长的那么多伙伴在一起哦，然后想要往净零呢更迈进一步哦。那欧莱德做碳中和的经验其实是非常早，我们在2006年就制定了这个计划了，是已经16年前了。然后呢，做我们台湾的第一个碳足迹的盘查，环保署的，在2010年完成第一个碳足迹的盘查，拿到标签。接着2011年，我们就做了产品的碳中和。那一直到2年前呢，我们做全产品全组织的碳中和。所以我们一直以来这10几年都没有停过哦。那我希望在这很短的时间之内来跟大家分享我们的一些经验，还有我们的一些对未来的一些看法哦。对，那 一切的起源呢就很简单，谁可以帮我按好 ？OK， 从任何采取企业应该做的永续行动和减少温室排放的一些风险的话，就是从碳足迹盘查开始，这是所有行动企业界做的第一个应该做的起源哦。那找出碳排放的热点，然后制定各种的计划，然后让把碳排放的热点的这个碳排放降低。那产品生命周期里面就是一个最好的一个说明了，从原料取得、制造、生产、运输、销售、消费者使用到废弃回收，从生命的5个周期里面呢去进行全面性的一个碳盘查哦。那大家知道我们做洗发精，我们从来不知道谈洗发精。如果做这样的一个盘查里面，最高的排放热点其实是消费者使用，因为一个产品呢可能用80次到200次，每一次都需要水，而且是热水，热水是需要加温的哦。那甚至洗完头发还要去吹头发，把它吹干。但是整个消费情境之中呢，我们是把它纳入在产品的一个碳足迹的盘查之中。所以如果把消费者这个地方纳进的话，你可以看到它占到80%几个%。如果把消费者剔除的话呢，在废气的部分呢就占得非常高。所以这就是我们想要解决的一个热点的一个排放啊。在没有盘查之前，我们是完全不知道这个比例的啊。然后我们就进行一连串的碳足迹盘，能够帮我按吗？好，谢谢。这是我们全公司全组织的一个碳排查，就是可以看得到我们整个产品的全公司产品的碳排查。如果把范畴3纳进来的话呢，可以占了91.23% 哦。所以我们现在到现在这个阶段10几年下来的话，我们觉得我们要跟消费者一起努力才有办法。所以我们除了产品制造以外，用我们的洗发精可以很快的冲干净哦，甚至很快的吹干，然后冲水的时候其实不用太多的水就可以清洗干净，已经是变成我们的标准的制造产品的标准了啊。那接下来就是怎么做环境教育呢？来跟我们供应链的上下游一起来做这个努力。那我要说明一下，我们公司现在做的碳中和是包含了范畴1、范畴2，还有范畴3。所以任何使用我们公司产品的消费者，他的所有的就是使用阶段的碳排放，我们是完全都帮他综合掉了。好，谢谢。那这是我们公司展开了一个策略地图，只是想做碳足迹的一个事情，那我们做了一个策略地图。其实这个策略地图的这个数大概是现在2倍大了，我现在拿的还是旧版的就是绿色原料、绿色包装就绿色原料就是 bio-based 的，就是不再用地底下的石化材料，全部用地表上生态循环的材料。那包装的话，就是在2017年开始我们公司所有的洗沐产品都是100% 的 PCR。就是 post consumer recycle， 在整个循环的过程之中那可以降低60到80% 的碳排放环保署有公告各种塑胶材料的回收的碳排放的降低那这样的话确实对减排有造成很大的影响那再来就是绿色工厂到100%的绿电，那100%的绿电我们在今年年底的目标呢就希望能够达成，我们现在已经超过60%，那这2个月有机会达到就是100%所以在自己的供应链的内部的话减排呢，我们希望能够减到100%。那在范畴3的部分呢，希望我们用碳中和的方式来把它碳排放的降低。OK， 那目标呢就是做到零碳排和零环境冲击那我们在2020年就做全组织和全产品的碳中和，一直到现在。那做了这一段以后呢，我们发现呢，我们未来可能要把产品看能不能有机会往负碳的发展，甚至因为这些减排呢，希望未来的法规呢，像我们希望如果能够减排是有价值的话呢，我们可能会拥有碳权那再来就是为了因应风险的话呢，我们其实有碳存部，一个公司里面有黄金存折可能有黄金存折、期货的存折，可是呢，一个公司里面可能还没有碳存折，所以我们公司呢也往碳存折来发展好，那我们怎么去执行公司治理方面呢？去执行碳中和计划呢？其实就是全面性的那在财务报表上面呢，我们就是 SBTi 用科学的方法来证明我们公司在减排在这些行动上面的一个成效。那 TCFD 呢，就是把我们的气候风险呢纳入在财务揭露的范围，让投资者呢可以知道说这我们因应调适气候变迁带来的一个财务投资的风险。那这里有一个很好大家有听过 SROI 就是社会投资效益的风险评估。那我们公司其实已经进入到 CROI 就是 Carbon Return on Investment， 就是碳投资管理的效益评估那这在未来呢，我相信每个公司呢都会涉猎到这个，因为当碳呢是形成负债的时候，或是碳是你资产的时候呢，其实这个事情就变得非常重要了那在人的部分我们怎么去做呢？就是做永续圈的发展。我们公司有17个部门，那永续圈呢有3个永续圈就好像品管圈一样，把各部门不同的人才聚集在一起那目标呢就是做创新，这个创新呢是对公司的永续和减碳呢是有意义的那我们是用这样的方式去处理就是组织。那碳存部和碳地价，那碳在公司呢可能是负债，可能是 资产。那我们公司的碳定价是1公斤，就是我们的碳的定价是869.6。就是1吨那这是如果你的企业你的组织排碳太高的话呢，是必须要负责的这是我们公司。好，那我们积极的希望开发负碳的产品那这个我一直讲负碳这个事情呢，应该是相对值，不是绝对值因为我们存在就有碳排放对。那相对值就是我们如果在过去我们这个行业里面的碳排放呢，能够往下往回走那我认为这个是有价值，所以我们希望能够不停的去开发这一类的商品出来那这个刚好是在今年场合，刚刚的 David 就是 VERRA 的这个标准的组织在里面。其实我们公司很早就进行碳交易了我们在台湾的企业里面可以说是最早进行碳交易的，在2011年我们就进行碳交易了那现在主要都是欧盟的水力发电为主那各位可以注意看去年底的 AR6 报告 ，IPCC AR6 报告里面告诉我们，2030年每1吨碳可能在300块美金以上，未来还会更高。各位想想看，这是多么让人家震惊的一件事情那当这个300块美金是你们贵公司负碳的是你的负债的时候，那就很可怕了好。那我们公司呢，因为有纯碳，为什么？因为我们要承诺碳中和嘛那碳中和一定是今年做的事情，明年要验证那我们既然做了这个承诺的时候，我们就要先把这个碳给存起来那因为我们做到范畴3，所以我们自己再怎么减还是不够，因为消费者的碳所以我们把这个纳进来以后呢，我们就必须要有负碳的存布。那我们就透过交易市场那很可惜的是，台湾一直没有交易市场我想我和李建明老师都在呼吁说，希望台湾有碳交易的市场。像看到新加坡马上就成立了 CIX那再来就是你要有哪一些机制才会有第三方信任受到欧洲到美国去才会被人家信任所以这也很重要。所以我们透过了这样的一个就是VCS 的这样的一个标准那在 VERRA 的这个组织的认证之下所以我们取得这个碳权。那这个东西放在那边一定是变成你的费用嘛，对不对？不，它是你的资产它是你的资产，而且它的资产还会增值当然会使用的。如果我现在有点后悔，就当初没有买太多。我现在买多一点的话，我就可以分给我那些朋友，今年要做碳中和的朋友了因为其实我早期最早1吨碳是买1块钱美金，1块钱美金你现在的话 VCS 最少都10块美金到50块美金，看你碳的品质如果是政府制定碳额度的话，可能都是在100块美金以上正在往300块美金在发展那我们公司呢，把这些现金放在经由 KPMG 认证我们已经可以放在就是无形资产里面了就是已经纳入了，所以这里面呢，我们已经有这个资产在这里面 OK 好。那当然我们也希望做了这么多事情，也希望有一些期许啦。那我认为呢，当 COP 会议以后制定各国的碳排放的标准那对他们期许以后，那这个国家制定的碳净零政策后，一定下放到企业，企业就一定会有碳额度，产业一定有碳额度，甚至我预告未来个人都有碳额度，这是未来的所以我觉得台湾一定要有交易所，那一定要有方法学，一定要有碳额度的机制出来好，那我在今天有一个最重要的一个观点，做那么多年，我想有一个心得，我们在企业界服务了就是数位转型，我们讲了很久，数位转型带来新的经济物种是什么？过去我们在念书的时候都没有学到，你要先面临的数位转型带来新的经济物种 ，Bitcoin 比特币 ，NFT 就是数位转型新的经济物种。那新的商业模式，我讲个最简单的 Uber E ，Foodpanda 就是因为数位转型带来新经济模式。那我们现在谈净零转型，那净零转型带来新的经济物种会是什么？我讲一个碳权，甚至讲碳币，就是这个，我们必须要非常立刻马上的要去了解它。那带来新的商业模式是什么？你减碳可能会有价值的。我讲到一件，我这2天在讲那个台北市选举的事情我说以前我们拿悠游卡嘛进站的时候说逼一下是什么？要把悠游卡的储值减一下，对不对？可是呢，当有碳额度的时候呢，今天进到台北市开车的人都有总排量，对不对？那再对比今天所有做捷运的人，也许一个开车的人可能要付4张做捷运人的票，所以以后你的储值卡是去做捷运的时候呢是增值，你懂我意思吗？是很多开汽车的碳排有没有交给这个因为做公共交通工具减排的人未来的社会我预告可能会变成这样子所以负债跟你的资产是2件事情的。最后我举2家公司就做一个结束2家公司历史2020年就是特斯拉它还是在亏损，它是亏损8.59亿美金它卖了碳权，因为加州有碳额度的机制所以卖汽油车的要去跟卖电动车的人买碳权 OK 好，那它这个交易 那获利15.8亿美金。所以2020年是特斯拉第一次财务报表赚钱，就创造了新的全球首富。它是全球知名品牌里面交车数量最少的公司，结果它是这是别人最期待的，就是它的估值是最高的一个公司，这是一个很大的转变，这是资产。那我再讲一个负债，最后讲一个负债。埃克森美孚石油公司你知道它现在1年的碳排放量大概是对不起，上个页1.12吨吨的二氧化碳排放量。如果以现在100块美金的今年交易大概100块美金的这个碳额度碳费来讲的话，它大概负债就是110亿美金。那我们看它过去5年的财务报表，平均是赚80亿美金，也就是说它1个月就亏损了1年就亏损30亿美金。我相信它5到10年就要倒了。如果你用300块美金来算的话，它应该这2年就要倒了。所以这就是负债，这就是负债那这2个我这2个极端的例子来大家思考一下，我们企业在经营的时候，未来所面临的挑战，还有我们需要合作的地方，迈向努力的地方会是在哪里好，那最后就是这个就是待会李建明老师应该是比我更内行了关于这个就是找方法学啦，那让减碳是有价值化的是这样子。我们一讲负碳要付出成本，可是没有想到减碳其实是有价值化的这一件事情好，好，今天跟大家分享的地方就在这，希望今天的伙伴刚刚讲罗志英讲伙伴在一起，那希望大家一起努力，都是为了我们的未来能够更加的美好。谢谢大家，谢谢。
谢谢 Thank you, Mr. Ko. Thank you for letting us know about how you created your product and becoming more sustainable, as well as sharing with us 2 case studies on how carbon credit exchange is not a debt, but it's an asset in the future. 接下来就进入到我们的 QA session 的部分。We're now going to officially enter into our QA panel session, and we will have Professor Lee to ask our guest online, Mr. Antonioli, as well as Ms. Soh, a few questions.
好，那因为我们时间已经越来越紧所以我想我们这个 section 那基本上我们大概就开放几个问题，那让我们现场的贵宾如果能够对我们CIX 还有这个 VERRA 那么他们2位贵宾还在线上，那另外也有葛董那在现场，那所以我想我是当主持人，所以我就先保持我的问题我想开放给我们现场的贵宾，请如果有想要提问的你可以用中文，那我们这边会有翻译那可以透过翻译请教我们的外国的朋友外国的贵宾。
好谢谢各位那个前辈们的一些那个说明我想请问一下，因为各企业在做碳权这一块的时候在讨论碳权这部分的时候，因为大家减碳的能力其实都还没有那么的强，因为技术上的一个原因但是当我们考虑到可能未来40年、50年的时候，各企业现在积极的在发展一个减碳的技术。那未来假设大家都把这个减碳能力越做越好的时候，那各企业其实都渐渐达到净零的这个目标的时候，会不会那个碳价会开始有一点往下掉？然后这又会跟那个大家要把这个减碳能力，把这个减碳达到减碳的这个目标开始做一个拉扯，因为碳价可能会跟大家减碳的意愿会有一个拉扯嘛。这是第一个我想要请教的问题。那第二个可能跟碳权不是绝对相关的，但是我是在想说，当我们要去推净零的时候因为政府现在目前其实是对企业去课碳税，那假如我们把这个课碳费，那假如我们把这个碳费一部分是课征在产品上面的时候，其实是利用民众的一个力量。因为民众大家知道他的去买东西的时候，去额外付碳费的时候，其实会有一个更大的意愿去选择低碳商品。这应该是会大大的推进我们由民众的选择去引导企业做减排的一个动作。那以上是2个问题，想请教一下。 谢谢。
谢谢你的问题。你有没有要请教我们在现场的贵宾哪一位回答你这个问题？如果没有特定的话，就是我回答啊。你有没有要特别请那个？
第一个问题可能就请那个欧莱德的这个董事长来回答好。那第二个问题可能再请教主持人您这边。
好，谢谢。好，那我想我们就请葛董先简单回复我们第一个问题。
我是想回答，不过线上的2位其实都可以回答，一个是交易所的，一个是标准的。对，那要不要老师？
是，谢谢啊。我想这2个问题待会也可以请你翻译给他，看他们能不能回应啊。那我想我先回答你2个问题啊。你的第一个问题很有趣啊，就大家尽量做减排以后，未来碳价会不会因此而下跌？因为需求少了嘛，那甚至可能供给多。那我想这个情况是这样这个是有可能发生，但是会很长一段时间，因为随着你的减排，你的活动还是在。你的很多经济规模活动还在增加，所以你减排的这个部分很可能还是会跟你的整个活动的增长，你还是会还会留下很多需要去净零的部分。如果今天不是净零的话，您刚刚讲的这件事，如果大家都开始做很大的减排，那是很快这个碳权的市场供需的关系、市场的关系，它的价格就会下降。那因为是净零的这个关系所以你永远要净零，就永远要努力下去。而且我另外提一点，我们现在所谈的是2050年净零，其实2050年之后没有人谈，是因为2050年之后其实是要负碳，所以也就是说，我们现在用这样的一个碳价讯号，可能会很长一段时间会一直维在一个高档，因为人类呢把过去270年来的产生的这个对地球的碳负债，我们未来要很长的时间，要比这个还更长。为什么？因为它停留在我们大气层的那个温室的逸散可能要数十年、数百年，甚至数千年、数万年都有。所以人类呢是一条不归的路，所以我们用这个碳的这个讯号、碳价的讯号，那么可能会维持一段很长，还是会很高。那因为这个是一个基本的经济学原理，就是供需，也就是一个物品的稀缺性的时候，它就会很有价格。我想这是第一点。第二点，你刚刚的问题是这样今天如果您是讲碳税的话，您的刚刚的讲法是可行的因为碳税就是可能在我们的最终产品上去加一个税。可是今天很可惜的是，政府不是要这样做，他想要对我们的大排放源要去加在它的这个成本上，所以那叫碳费，所以它就不能够到产品里面去，所以您刚刚讲的那效果就不会有。那现在就会变成回来是这样子，当它在这个我们的大排放源这个产品上的时候，它会产生一个现象，一个就是如果它这个产品非常对这个市场有一个 dominant， 它可以很容易去转嫁给消费者。但如果它现在是 B to B 它在供应链的时候它要转嫁就很困难，因为你要转给你下一个手的这个，他不会同意的，所以呢就会出现呢。那么如果是对于一些对消费者的市场的话，透过碳费还是可以转出去，可是呢那个是一个成本的外转，所以并不会让消费者觉得他要负担这个税所以这个费。那如果是在供应链的话，那很可能你是转不出去的因为供应链都很硬，所以呢这个厂商就必须要自行吸收。所以在这种情况下，可能收这个碳费的话，就看这个厂商的情况，所以它最后很可能就是会折损到它的竞争力。我想这个是您刚刚2个问题，我这样简单的一个回应。我不知道你可以把这个问题翻译给
Thank you, Mr. Antonioli and Ms. Soh. We were just discussing 2 questions, and Professor Lee made a few remarks, and we will also like to hear from your opinions if you have a different perspective on this. One of our audience asked, the first question is that understanding that Taiwan currently has a lack of technology, even though we're developing, continue towards reaching net zero. But let's say by 2040, we do reach net zero. Is there a possibility that the value of carbon itself will no longer be so valuable as we hear now, that it is so promising that standard could be restructured, standard could be readjusted, so that will actually impact the value of carbon. And the second question is it possible for companies to put carbon tax, applying it on products? And from Professor Lee's response, it is that it is inapplicable in Taiwan because our policy requires companies to regard carbon emission added to the cost of the product. So if it's from the perspective of B2C, it is possible, it is likely, but if it is from the possibility of supply chain, we're afraid that companies pretty much have no way out. And those are the two questions that one of our audience asked. Yes. So do we have any additional insights from Ms. Soh or Mr. Antonioli by any chance?
I'm happy to answer the first question. I don't know the legislation and the mechanics of how climate change or greenhouse gas emissions are regulated in Taiwan, so I can't really speak to that. But I think the first question is a very good one. And if I understand it correctly, the question is, well, if we achieve net zero by 2040, what's going to be the value of carbon credits and should we still be investing in it? And I think it's a very valid question. I think there's two parts to it. So, and that's great. I'd love to hear an audience member say, hey, what if we achieve net zero by 2040? Hardly anybody ever says that, right? People think, oh, 2050 is almost impossible. So first of all, thank you for the optimism on achieving net zero way earlier than what most people think is possible. But say Taiwan does get there and it's net zero by 2040. Net zero, remember, means that you're still having to remove greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. You're drawing that carbon dioxide into removals. So those kinds of projects will have a very high value because you will be wanting to, and you'll be needing to have those kinds of projects in the mix in order to make that net zero possible. So there is a logic, I think, that says that for a long time, even when you do meet net zero, having to, that the value of carbon credits will be high because you'll still need to do that. Now, maybe even by 2050 and 2060, we don't need that many more removals because we actually are able to wean ourselves further from greenhouse gas emissions. And that does bring to a close this idea of compensating for credits. And quite frankly, that's a good world, right? I mean, let's recognize that the value of a carbon credit today is because it can avoid an emission to the atmosphere or can draw carbon out of the atmosphere. But when we are able to develop an economy that doesn't need to do that anymore, well, then we've had a victory. But the key consideration here is that carbon today is very valuable. Every ton that goes to the atmosphere is causing more damage, and that has a value, and that's why the voluntary market exists. But over time, my guess is that projects that avoid emission reductions will at some point fall in price and fall in demand because we won't need them anymore. Because companies, we will be achieving net zero. If in your scenario by 2035, Taiwan doesn't need to avoid that many emissions, right? Most of the emissions will have been addressed and will be on the way to net zero, but we'll still need those removals. So that really calls into focus the idea that you need both avoided emission reductions and removals today. Over time, you will have less need for avoided emissions, but we still need them today. And over time, you'll need even more removals. So there's kind of a interesting logic in how the pricing will play for different credits, but there will be a transition. But bottom line, I think right now, today, we are in a world where there's huge amounts of emissions, and we're just starting to get on that pathway to net zero. So there's quite a bit of a demand. And I think that for the next, 5 years, at least 10 years, there will be quite a bit of demand for carbon credits, both removals and avoidance.
Thank you, Mr. Antonioli. 这边简短的 Mr. Antonioli 的意思是说，我们有这么正向的来看，说2014年，假如真的是有达到所谓的 net zero 的话，这是一个很好的一个态度。但是对他来说，我们才刚开始，以全球化来说，我们才刚开始，所以 至于未来是否 carbon 的这个价格会再掉，或者是掉的很多，这边没有人能够知道，但是多多少少它会受影响。那以现在而言，刚才 Mr. Antonioli 也有提到说，所谓的在比较偏 carbon sink， 所谓的这个碳汇的部分，在台湾郊外或者是台湾比较偏乡的部分，我们可以做这种碳汇的这种 project， 光是这个部分就已经是一个市场，一个有价值的一个市场。对，以上。
好，谢谢啊。我想因为时间的关系啊，所以我想主持人刚刚那有举手吗？哦，是，我们再给最后一个问题好了。哦，这边还有，好，我们就请先请那位后面的先生好了哈，谢谢。对，后面那个举手先生，谢谢。好，那看起来我们这个时间可能会稍微 delay 啊，那我们但尽快把它这个结束哈，来请啊。
各位先进好，我是刘家宏。那我有一个问题 for Mr. Antonioli. I'm John Liu. I'm now working for an EMS producer in Synergy as carbon emission management consultant. I have a question. When we are applying carbon assets, we need to submit the project design document. I have question one. Is that how long will the PDD will be approved? That's the question one. And the question two is that if the PDD approval time is take too long, do VERRA have any thoughts about how to short the PDD approval time? That's the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I know it's a very, ripe topic. I think the answer to you is the better quality the project document, the quicker you will get it back. And what we have seen in the market recently, especially with the growth, is that there's lots of projects coming through the door, and we've seen a steady decrease in the quality of the projects. We've seen it both that in the quality of the documents, but also in the quality of the work that the auditors are doing. So we're working very hard to strengthen and support the auditors so they can do a better job. At the end of the day, we should be getting documents that need hardly any review. But the reality is that we're getting documents that are in very poor shape, and we have to push back, and so it takes a long time. So as a project developer, I urge you to submit good quality documents and to make sure that they are, because if they're not, you're going to be in a heap of pain because they're going to take a long time to approve. Good projects get approved pretty quickly, but it's the projects that are not so good that really cause a lot of headaches. So I'm sorry to put it back on you, but it's true for projects. So there really needs to be a strong effort, and we're working with the auditors to support that, but we need the project developers to support that as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Antonioli. 我们还有一个问题开放，我们这个问题开放是针对Miss Soh CIX。Miss Soh CIX， 请问我们会众当中有没有问题想要问有关 CIX 的部分？好，我们后面有一位，然后我们的麦克风最后面，对。
各位前辈先进好，我是台湾碳资产的刘德安。我有一个 CIX 的问题是想请教，因为我们知道新加坡政府在2030年，它有去推动就是新加坡的一个绿色蓝图的计划，但是在亚洲国家，从就是去年开始，中国碳排放交易中心7月16号正式成立以后，它是在整个中国地区针对先行包含电力或者是钢铁行业进行碳排放的一个标准的一个制定，要求它所有的一个产业，就是相关的先试型的产业，必须要能够把它的一个减额碳排放的部分放到交易所平台。那因为我知道 CIX 的部分，它是主体是针对就是所谓的自愿性碳排 VCS 相关的一个部分的一个就是交易。我想知道的是说，在新加坡政府这边，依据 CIX 的平台里面，对于目前现行的就是新加坡本地的企业， 他们在做有关于这种减碳台的部分，他们实质在 CIX 的一个交易所的实际作为。另外一点的话，我也想要去理解，就是目前在新加坡 CIX 的一个交易所的部分，它未来在东南亚的一个布局跟东南亚国家之间的合作，会如何去增进它在这个区域里面的影响力？谢谢。
Hi, Ms. Soh. Would you need me to translate it for you, or you would just answer it in English?
I'll need a translation for the first question, just to be sure I understood it.
Okay, so our gentleman has two questions. The first question he mentioned about is about the relationship between Taiwan and China, how there's a tense relationship in that, and so in this sense, we have no choice but to submit our carbon data on a trading platform. And so how would you see from the perspective of CIX? Yes, that's for the first question.
Okay, so I understood it slightly differently, but I'll just kind of touch on that. I think the question was around reporting. So I think when it comes to governments putting out the green plan or asking for organizations to be scoped under compliance schemes, it really is down to the specific jurisdiction to decide which industries will be impacted, as well as which targets they would be setting against them. So in Singapore, for example, as part of the green plan, nearly 80% of the national emissions are covered currently under a carbon taxation scheme. So each company as of today pays 5 Singapore dollars per ton of emissions. They've announced that this $5 a ton number will grow to $25 in 2 years' time, and will be growing to maybe $50 to $80 per ton by 2030. So my understanding is really the way that our jurisdiction has done this is to signal to companies that there is a 10-year path forward where the price of carbon that isn't mitigated will be $5, $25, and then $50 to $80 a ton. And it creates incentives for people to essentially do the reductions. And even then, it's not carbon credits that will be used immediately to address all of these emissions. Under the taxation scheme, the current plans in Singapore are only 5% of emissions can be mitigated through the use of quality carbon credits. So whether or not that's common, it actually is. We see that in many different jurisdictions. I think Taiwan has also announced a similar approach, that essentially there will be a tax, and a component of that tax can be used to be mitigated via carbon credits. I guess the reporting standards are really different. In Singapore, it's actually a government agency that collects reporting information, not CIX. We see ourselves more as the place in which you're able to access those credits, retire those credits, and report those credits. But it's quite different from the reporting of emissions itself, which may require specific formats or specificities that an individual government would require. And that's where I think the blurring of lines between voluntary and compliance markets will be an interesting trend for us to keep an eye on. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Soh. That was definitely providing us more insight for the gentleman's questions. And now we're handing the microphone back to Professor Lee.
Okay, thank you. 我想我们因为今天非常难得邀请到2位贵宾，所以我们的时间那么这个稍微耽误，但是也不能够影响到我们下一场，所以我想我担任这个主持人那我想我就宣布我们这一场的这个panel discussion 我想在这里我们就要给它做一个结束。那谢谢我们这个在线上的2位贵宾David and Jenny. Many thanks for your joining us this morning. I hope we can see anywhere in the near future. Thank you. 那我想也谢谢葛董那我想我们今天的这样的一个这个场次我们就到这里结束谢谢大家，谢谢